See anything?
He's mine! Let me take him. You get out of here.
You have my friend.
He's not your friend. I'll give you money.
Be quiet. Come on.
You should have taken the money.
I know. I'm a fool.
I don't think anyone would argue with me saying Charles Smith is one of the more beloved characters of Red Dead Redemption 2, if not the most beloved. Quiet, respectful, yet brutal when he has to be. Charles commands a lot of love and respect, not just from other gang members such as John, Sadie, and Arthur himself, but we as players. And Charles's backstory is one that has to be the most unique ever presented in a video game. Being half Native American and African American at the end of the 19th century, during a time when African Americans were barely being awarded their freedom from slavery, while Native Americans were being persecuted, seen as nothing more than savages that refused to adopt a more civilized way of living. Both were second-class citizens in the middle of a burgeoning nation. With Charles's unique heritage and calm yet somewhat intimidating demeanor, he was, and frankly still seen as the perfect character for a follow-up to this game. He's seen as someone that would be a perfect protagonist in his own game, trying to find his place in a world that doesn't exactly welcome him for reasons that are not entirely his fault. We can all continue to hope and pray that one day Rockstar will continue with Charles' story, but for now, let's take a look at the Charles Smith we're introduced to and slowly start to get a better understanding of as the game progresses.
I said, did you fools shoot those bison?
Calm down, you black or red bastard, whatever the fuck you are.
Did you shoot them? Yes, we did. We shot them bison. We'll shoot you too if you don't get.
What business is it of yours? What? Wait.
It's that business of mine!
Now, apart from Charles's interesting backstory, badass appearance, and respectful demeanor, Charles has another significance to the character of Arthur Morgan. And it's really that I want to explore most of in this video. So yes, I will touch on some of the things Charles gets into in the epilogue. It's really the main story, though, that I want to discuss because I feel this is where most of Charles's own character and sense of genuine belonging finally starts to take place. And Charles is almost the direct opposite of Arthur at particular times of the story. And if you compare the way Charles acts with the Vanderlyn gang at the beginning of the game to how he acts with the Wapiti Indians towards the end, you can see the contrast of how he treats his time with both of them, which we'll get into. But first, let's talk about how Charles got introduced to the Vanderlyn gang. This might sound a little funny to follow that up with by saying the exact details of Charles joining the Vanderlyn gang aren't exactly known, but at the start of Red Dead Redemption 2, Charles has been riding with the gang for about 6 months, as of the time they were retreating into the mountains following the aftermath of the failed Blackwater robbery. We find Charles recovering from a hand injury, lending his knowledge in hunting and using a bow to Arthur. There isn't much significance really pulled out of this time with Charles besides him staying with the gang because they treat him fair.
I just thought you might have moved on by now.
You want me to move on?
No, not at all. I know you could run it alone, no problem.
I did that for a long time. I'm done with it. Always wondering if someone's gonna kill you in your sleep. Sure, I could fall in with another gang, but Dutch... You know, Dutch is different.
Oh yes, Dutch is certainly different.
He treats me fair. Most of you do. And for a fellow with a black father and an Indian mother, that ain't normally the case.
By his own words, Charles believes in Dutch's philosophy, and it's his vision, his teachings, and the gang's overall fair treatment that keeps him involved in wanting to stay. Now, I played the extra clip where he mentions it's better to be with a group that he can somewhat trust rather than live on his own or hop from group to group. And the reason why I played that is because it pretty much gives Charles his reason behind staying with the Vanderlyn gang. Dutch is different. Everyone treats him fair, and it's out of a mutual sense of trying to survive. There's nothing beyond that. Does that mean Charles doesn't care for these people on a personal level? Not at all. All I'm saying is it's a mix of mutual interest and self-preservation to a degree, and that is why he's around. He cares little for the inner politics of the gang, and that's apparent anytime there's an argument between Arthur and Micah, or quarrels from one gang member to the other. It could be at a sheer coincidence that he's never around when something like this happens, but given how Charles isn't present during any missions that require some sort of revenge, such as going up to 6 Point Cabin, any kind of mindless killing or harming what could be seen as innocent people, yet at the same time being one of the more stable and reliable gunmen, someone who the other gang members would immediately turn to when they need a no bullshit type of approach and would actually stay calm. At least, this is how Charles is presented during the first 3 chapters of the game, with his presence in the main missions being just a no-nonsense enforcer or taking part in saving someone such as Sean, or how vital Charles's tracking skills were when it came to saving Trelawney from a bunch of bounty hunters. Then it could be taken as intentional writing by Rockstar to show that he is just following Dutch's own beliefs by sticking to saving fellow gang members and not getting so wrapped up in the smaller issues between everyone. He didn't grow up under the supervision of Dutch after all, so he lacks the sense of owing Dutch or trying to get into his good graces like Micah, Arthur, or even John to a small degree. A degree that really Arthur kind of brings him into. But Charles, for the most part, exhibits a level of carelessness on that stuff as Arthur does when it comes to helping others outside of the gang. Charles is here to do what he needs to in order to ensure his and the gang's mutual benefit of surviving and staying one step ahead of the law that's on their tail. He's treated fairly by the rest of the gang members, but thanks to Dutch seemingly being so different than any other outlaw or gang he's fallen into with before, he's more than willing to buy into Dutch's fancy words, while also seeing through Dutch's attempts at filtering the more distasteful dealings of the gang, such as killing and robbing. Even he says, despite Dutch's talk, you can't kill and rob people pleasantly.
And how's that different from anywhere else?
Well, maybe it's not. I just heard some of the army out here was particularly unpleasant about it.
Unpleasant? How do you rob and kill people pleasantly? We don't, in spite of Dutch's talk.
While Charles' position within the gang is definitely a unique one, since he's only been with them for about 6 months, and despite the relative short period of time compared to many other members, he has managed to acquire a high level of respect from at least Arthur, something that is immediately apparent through the very first interactions between the two of them, all the way out in the chapter of Coulter. The way Arthur mentions he thought Charles would have run off by now, betraying a hint of embarrassment at the gang's unfortunate series of mishaps, and even backpedaling his statement when he thought Charles was slightly offended by that comment. It's quite clear that there's a high level of mutual respect, and Arthur without a doubt acknowledges the importance of Charles's help.
How long you been with us now? 5, 6 months?
Something like that?
Bet you didn't expect this.
What?
Any of this. The Blackwater mess. Being up here?
Sooner or later, a job's gonna go wrong. Nature of life.
I just thought you might have moved on by now.
You want me to move on?
No, not at all. I know you could run it alone, no problem.
He solidifies that a little further by words of affirmation, but just hearing how he backtracks and puts what he means within the context of everything going wrong, it's a small yet subtle way that displays how Arthur deals with any kind of emotional vulnerability. It's not entirely different than how he's able to admit to everyone that he's hurt for how John found it so easy to just throw him away and run off. By putting it within the context of betraying the code of the gang, Arthur admits that there's a personal level of anger and pain. He admits it in the light of loyalty within the gang, but it's more so out of being cast away and abandoned, possibly due to his own past as being an orphan. It might sound as if me saying he envies Charles is a bit of a stretch, but he admits it himself. One of the earlier parts where we get to see the relationship of Charles and Arthur start to really evolve is during the mission of Strange Kindness. During this time, both Arthur and Charles are tasked for venturing out to look for a new area to relocate the entire Vanderland gang. While out prospecting a new piece of land, Arthur and Charles come across a woman and her 2 children hiding underneath a wagon. Terrified, the woman is armed with a loaded shotgun, ready to defend her children in case they were to be kidnapped just as her husband was. Arthur, moved a little about their predicament, told her and her 2 kids to fuck off, basically. They need the land, and as sad as it is, the problem is not Arthur's. Charles, however, had different plans.
Go, we need the land, go. Get the hell out of
They
here.
took off Ozza.
Who did?
Men last night.
Where? Where did they take him?
Ain't no business of ours.
If it wasn't for Charles intervening, who knows if Arthur would have taken pity on the woman and her children. It's up for speculation, but what we get between the two of them is a small discussion where Arthur tries to justify his lack of enthusiasm to help by reminding Charles of the gang's current situation.
What's going on with you?
What do you mean?
You were just gonna send that woman and her children on their way?
We're wanted, man. We got Pinkertons breathing down our necks. We should be moving camp, not running off on some wild goose chase.
Come on, Arthur. That's not how you are.
In the moment, the back and forth serves little purpose other than seeing how cold Arthur could be, having a tunnel vision on achieving the sole thing he set out to do. Arthur had no interest in any Good Samaritan work, having no second thoughts at just sending some immigrants that don't even speak their new country's native tongue to go out and fend for themselves. Fend for themselves in an area that they've already been attacked in and undoubtedly would be sought out for again as their father was being held for ransom. Later on, though, in private, Arthur admits in his journal that Charles is a better man than him, not having to think to be good, as if the sense of doing the right thing is deep within him, as opposed to Arthur, who has what he describes as a conflict between good and evil that rages within him. It's a moment that can easily fly over your head if you don't really pay attention between the back and forth. And I'm not saying necessarily within just this moment here, but other moments as well, from saving Sean to even saving Arthur's life during Clement's Point. Arthur tells Sean, all the way back in Horseshoe Overlook, that it was thanks to Charles that he's even here saving his life.
Do I get a hug, Arthur? A warm embrace for a lost brother now found.
You know, nothing means more to me than this gang. The bond we share. It's the most real thing to me. I would kill for it, I would happily die for it. But in spite of all of that, I would have easily left you here to rot if Charles hadn't stopped me.
And then when Arthur's held by his neck, Charles ends up saving him, denying the opportunity, as small as it was, to get paid and just leave Arthur to die. It's something he does eventually use as leverage to get Arthur to agree to becoming a little bit more involved within the whole Wapiti situation at the end of the game, but he still does it. And even though Arthur does have a point in him not really having a dog within the fight that is the overall Wapiti situation, I think Charles was aware that Arthur was in his own head at the time. Yes, he was sick and everything he ever believed in was falling apart before his very eyes, but Charles knew he could not ensure the safety or even really the smallest chances of success without the presence of Arthur. Regardless of his health status, he was still very useful and still had a sense of obligation. Obligations returning the gratitude to his friend for saving his life. Speaking of the entire Wapiti situation, it's not until the chapter of Beaver Hollow that Charles is given more of a spotlight, and frankly what I would say is a real character development of his own, albeit not front and center and one that more so follows his own unique path. It also does not help that the entire chapter is filled with so much else going on that it's difficult to really keep track and focus on him and what he's going through, but the main thing to take away is Charles appears to finally have a true sense of belonging. The entire time Charles is on screen, he's given the position of a strong, competent, reserved gunman that's actually very loyal, despite what I would call a lack of emotional investment in the leadership or overall position within the gang. Again, caring little for the inner politics within the Vanderlyn gang. If you look into much of his in-game dialogue or even his hunting side activity though, you can see that deep down, even though he's leading a life similar to that of a regular outlaw, he's not entirely out of touch with his Native American heritage. And that could be a source of his own insecurity, an intense feeling of inadequacy that he may be trying to compensate for by lending so much of his help to the Wapitis. And let me explain that a little more. For those that have played the entire story of Red Dead Redemption 2, then you're well aware that following the Saint-Denis bank robbery, the Vanderlyn gang was left in a very vulnerable position to say the least. Dutch, Arthur, along with practically all the other enforcers and leadership of the gang was either killed or outright just ended up missing because, while trying to escape the growing presence of law enforcement in and around the city of Saint-Denis, they boarded a ferry that sunk out at sea, resulting in them being stranded on the tropical island of Guarma. Charles took part in the robbery as well, but thanks to some selfless courage and the ability to think very quickly on his feet, he was able to return to the rest of the gang hiding out in Shady Belle, and with the help of Sadie, the two of them led the gang to a new hideout. Charles and Sadie were practically the leaders of the gang, while Arthur and Dutch were stranded on the island of Guarma, struggling for a way to make it through the war that was ravaging the nation and then returned back safely to the United States. Now, as soon as Dutch returns, both Sadie and Charles return to their previous positions of working in the background. Sadie, while demonstrating her prowess as a capable leader, just goes back to being very angry at the world that took her previous life from her. While Charles, on the other hand, after helping Arthur find a new campsite out in Beaver Hollow, disappears only to reappear as a liaison of sorts between the Wapiti chief's son Eagle Flies and Dutch. Which obviously means at some point in time, we don't get to witness it ourselves, but Charles became aware of what was going on with the Wapitis. Most likely catching wind that there was talk they were going to be removed off their current reservation, thanks to the increased interest and cash flow of none other than Leviticus Cornwall, who believed there was oil, and with it augmented riches to be found under the feet of the Native Americans. In a position where they could not win any kind of violent war against the United States Army, and losing every bureaucratic approach, the Native Americans ended up being divided between father and son. The chief Rainsfall, who was aware of the tribe's weakened state and witnessed firsthand their inability to win any type of war against the United States Army, was all for peace, for thinking logically, rather than putting more of his people in danger. Eagle Flies, on the other hand, was frustrated by what he perceived as nothing else than his father being weak, and that weakness was being mistaken for wisdom. It's because of this that Eagle Flies decides to take matters into his own hands, falling time and again into the entrappings of the United States Army, who, under the command of Colonel Favors, adopted a culture dedicated to the harassment and disrespect of anything Native American, in the hopes of triggering a war that would be nationally seen as the fault of the Wapiti Indians. This is where Dutch Vanderlyn, Arthur Morgan, and Charles Smith all come into play. Dutch the entire time is the little devil on Eagle Flies' shoulder. It was Dutch's encouragement that led to Eagle Flies attacking a U.S. naval ship that was justified as them just retrieving some stolen horses, then the two of them ambushing a small U.S. patrol with the initial innocuous intention of just humiliating the small patrol. Then the situation quickly spiraled out of control, resulting in an all-out firefight between the Wapitis and the United States Army, ending in the capture of Eagle Flies. And then finally, Eagle Flies' attack on the oil refinery was also thanks to Dutch, who the entire time admitted to playing Eagle Flies and the Native Americans for nothing more than just smoke and some noise. Distractions to get the Pinkertons, the United States Army, and any other law enforcement off the back of the Vanderlyn gang. Something Charles, along with Arthur, immediately identified.
What do you think, Charles?
You know I told your father I will not fight over some horses.
But I made no such promise. Come along.
Yeah, Arthur, we must go with them to try to stop things from getting out of hand.
I guess. Come along.
Arthur and Charles end up trying to help by making sure Eagle Flies doesn't do anything too reckless that'll either get himself killed or make the overall situation of his people much worse. Arthur on multiple occasions pleads with Dutch to leave these people alone, that he, as well as practically everyone else but Eagle Flies himself, can see that Dutch is playing them for a bunch of fools. Charles, however, is back and forth in the ears of Eagle Flies and Rainsfall, trying his best to respect Rainsfall's wishes of keeping his people and even his son out of harm's way. During this time, pretty much the entire chapter, a massive chunk of Beaver Hollow, we see a very different Charles. I would even say it is the first genuine sense of belonging that he has. Not only do we see him much more present and in more missions than any other chapter before it, leading the charge in what's actually going on in these missions for once, but it appears Charles is finally having an emotional investment that wasn't there with the Vanderlyn gang, at least not to the same depths. And this is something that's even foreshadowed all the way back before chapter 2. On their way to Horseshoe Overlook, Charles is asked by Arthur what happened to his tribe. The way Charles responds is somewhat dry, but he does betray a hint of pain in his voice. He gives more information on his father being an alcoholic and how his mother, who was Native American, was one day just randomly taken by some soldiers of the United States and never heard from again. How the tribe he lived with was forced to leave their lands, and all these were accounts he says that were given to him by his father, because if it was true, he was really too young to remember.
So, what happened to your tribe?
I don't even know if I have one. At least, not that I can remember. My father was a colored man. He told me he lived with our people for a while. A number of free men did, but when we were forced to move from our lands, the three of us fled. I was too young to really remember much. My whole life I've been on the run. A couple years later, some soldiers captured my mother. Took her somewhere. We never saw her again. We drifted around. He was a very sad man, and the drink had a mean hold on him. Around 13, I just took off on my own.
Charles's account of what happened to him, his father, his mother, and what would have been his tribe echoes the exact situation the Wapiti Indians are going through. In the middle of fighting to keep their lands, their situation is further complicated by the anger and frustration of eagle flies and of course the encouragement of Dutch. It's almost as if Charles has two sides, two different backgrounds that are equally unwanted by this new civilized world, are colliding with each other. Here with the natives, it's his heritage. He never properly belonged to a tribe. It would only make sense that he has a strong interest and would practically adopt their traditions and overall belief system. It may be the only chance to get in touch with that side of him after all, and that might be something that he acknowledges. Yet because their situation is very delicate, being so similar to what his mother and her tribe may have experienced, Charles could have many unanswered questions and scenarios of what if he was older, or what if things could have been different all those years ago? Would he have been able to help somehow? Would he still end up on the run? Would he still end up without his mother? Would her fate be as horrible as it may have been? Stripped from her husband and son, sent God knows where, or possibly even killed? And would that have all resulted in him not really properly belonging to a tribe? All the what ifs, all the unanswered questions that come from his childhood, that come from that tribe that he never had, could be reignited and put at the forefront of his mentality, of his investment within the Wapitis. Right before all hell breaks loose between the army and the natives, Charles admits, after all, that this is his business, and he asks Arthur to come along to a meeting between both sides.
It ain't my business, brother.
No, I know. But it is mine. Do it for me?
Charles, I've
saved your life. Do it for me.
Sure. Come on.
And how could we skip the bond the two of them have? There's no doubt Charles and Arthur's mutual love and respect for each other only grows during this entire chapter. Between helping out Sadie, trying to get John to cut loose with Abigail and Jack, while trying his hardest to get Dutch to finally see a little bit of reason in everything he's been doing, Arthur does help the natives, and of course, Charles. And there's many moments where you see them develop a deeper love and respect for each other. There's quite a bit of conversations between the two of them, from their talks of Arthur slowly dying while they're traveling to go rescue eagle flies out in Fort Wallace, to discussing their backgrounds and mutual respect for Dutch in the earlier part of the game. But my favorite time between the two of them is during the entire mission of My Last Boy. As they get ready to descend on the oil refinery to help eagle flies and any other natives that partook in the assault, when Charles, without any kind of hesitation, says, "We're riding with you," as the music kicks in, paying homage to the Native American music at the time, it's just such a badass sequence. It's hard to not smile at it every single time it kicks off. And the fact that Charles and the natives, and even Sadie, stuck behind and said, "We're riding with you," it does play a little bit more into the whole idea or concept that Dutch and even Micah was saying, that Arthur and Charles betrayed him by working against him and helping the Native Americans, but that's a different thing.
That's right! Yeah!
Go with him. Try and help there. I'm better off alone.
We're riding with you.
Come on, then. Yeah!
That's right!
And their send-off at the end of the mission after witnessing eagle flies take his last breath is an equally sad yet badass moment between the two of them.
I'll stay and help them.
Yeah, I'll stay too.
No, my friend. You have others who need you. Good people.
It makes the absence of Charles during the last sequence where you play as Arthur even more heartbreaking. It's one of the biggest what-ifs the game has. What if Charles was present and was fighting by both John and Arthur's side? He wasn't a small character by any means, and it's interesting to see if he would hold any anger or resentment towards Dutch for using the Wapitis the way that he did, for destroying his own personal investment into finding a part of him that he's probably been missing his entire life. But that's obviously not the case. By a sense of obligation, possibly even feeling a little responsibility of Dutch's own actions, Charles decides instead to stay with the tribe and even helps them relocate up into Canada in an attempt to avoid a vengeful counterattack by the United States Army. Now, we don't hear much of Charles until the epilogue, where he's taking up illegal fighting in the streets of Saint Denis. After a small rekindling with John and Uncle, he agrees to come back to John's ranch out in Beecher's Hope and pretty much helps build John's entire house. Charles is also a big component of seeking out and paying Micah back for everything he's owed, for everything he did to Arthur, and ultimately being responsible for the entire gang's disintegration, or at least the rotting and corruption of Dutch's mind. And then it's said he disappeared up into Canada in hopes of settling down and finding a wife for himself. And that's all we hear of him. That's how the game ends, and the story of Charles Smith is concluded as far as we know, or as far as the events of Red Dead Redemption 2 go. Will we hear more of him in Red Dead Redemption 3 or any other future installment? Time could only tell, but considering the attachment many players have to him, it would be unfortunate if Rockstar doesn't follow it up with something, some type of information, whether through a newspaper article or word of mouth on what happens to Charles. But all things considered, I think Charles is a very important character. Not just for his role within the Vanderlyn gang, or even the unique heritage that he has, being Native American and African American, and how that plays out in the entire chapter of Beaver Hollow, but just bringing out a part of Arthur during pivotal parts of the story that without Charles, I don't really think we have a character that would manage to pull that side out of Arthur, to be so envious, or at least willing to openly admit that he does have a good side within him, and he's got to think about it, and it doesn't come just naturally to him as it does to someone like Charles, to someone that he has a very high level of respect for. And that's going to wrap it up for this video. Let me know what you think about Charles Smith, about his character development, and if there's anything I missed or anything else you want to add to him, or any other character you want to see me do in the future. I know many people have been talking about Trelawney, so we'll probably tackle him next, but like always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.